When I started my research into the internalization of sexual prejudice, or what some call internalized homophobia, back in the early 2000s, I already knew that I was living in a country that was inherently unfair. The cards of prosperity had been dealt, and the rules of distributing the cards had been set by cis hetero white men hundreds of years ago. I knew that my access to healthcare, education, food options, wealth were probably going to be fairly achievable as I shared the cis white male identifiers from the men who created the access rules to begin with. However, it only took a few lived experiences of me trying to be my whole queer self to recognize that access to finances, education, and housing might happen more easily for me, well, if I toned down the queerness inside me, maybe tried to assimilate into the surrounding culture a bit more. Thus began my journey into the closet, where I remained a majority of my young adult life. I never did have a problem receiving loans, accessing health care, getting an education, or finding healthy food options when I chose those. And yet, deep inside, I knew something was still wrong with the picture. There was a dull ache that surrounded my soul. I like to picture in my mind's eye the soul of an oppressed person as a bright yellow canary, an adorable small bird from the finch family. They have a vibrant color sometimes, and their song really does brighten up our world. That is, until they enter the coal mines of society's expected norms. You see, once that happens, the fumes of normative expectations enter the lungs of that tiny yellow soul, and at best sicken it, and at worst kill us. My dissertation supervisor at the time, Dr. Gary Burkholder, a research psychologist himself, warned me that often we research those things that touch our lives directly. He was not wrong. I suffered and continue to combat a sense of internalized homophobia, a fear to embrace my whole self. I breathed in the bad air of social norms that told me to butch it up, at least as best I could. And with each breath of that toxic air, I died a little more, my yellow feathers taking on the soot, the dirtiness of having to be something that I wasn't, until my yellow feathers really could not be seen anymore. Often I would try to force out a song from my tiny soot-covered chest, only to hear the antithetical whispers of the bold song that I was so convinced in my mind that I was singing. I lived so much of my life afraid that if I embraced my full self, people would harm me physically or emotionally alienate me. This inability to love ourselves wholly is brought about by societal pressures to assimilate to various cultures, white supremacy culture, to gender norms of the binary, or to sexual orientation of the dominant caste. These pressures to normalize have been institutionalized in our society over hundreds of years. The terrible result is what social epidemiologists call social determinants of health. These determinants are social constructs that gatekeep access to areas of health and well-being that are based on social constructs, things like race and gender, sexual orientation, and economic status, among others. Examples of social determinants of health include access to healthy food options, affordable housing, access to public transportation to make a living wage, language literacy, and so many other areas. Over the past year, we have watched the clear differences in access to areas of health and wealth have a direct negative impact on our siblings of color specifically. For example, in this county alone, housing inequities are rampant, and the pandemic only intensified the already existing racial differences. For example, after paying rent, Black households in this county are left with about $20,000, while white households are left with $52,000 in their respective annual household budgets for the year. Housing and economics aren't the only areas negatively affected by our pandemic and social determinants of health. We can see in our own county again in 2019 that white folks accounted for 65% of the makeup of this county and only 23% of the COVID positive population. This sits in stark contrast to the 35% of the county that identify themselves as Black, Indigenous, or other people of color, who make up 61% of the current COVID positive population. This past year has indeed provided us, many of us, whose privilege usually protects us from the proverbial coal mines, to instead witness the horrible death of the canary around us. It is brutal, unnecessary, and something that must change. Our faith calls us to identify our inherent worth and dignity of ourself while recognizing and balancing our individual place within the wider circle. This isn't always easy, and sometimes we accidentally lift up our own positions in society above the greater sum of our parts. For some of us who identify as white, it may have been difficult this past year to witness the death rattles around us, as it may have intensified a recognition of privilege that either we did not fully understand before or we were reluctant to look at during this past year. And it is so important that we understand that while these realizations may be new for some of us, this has been the only truth lived by millions of oppressed citizens over hundreds and hundreds of years. It's not news to them. White, cis-hetero maleness has been the assumed norm of this country since its torrid inception, and all of our institutions are tainted by that fact. Hundreds of years of disproportionate representation in all of the branches of our government, legislative, executive, and judicial, have resulted in these social determinants of health being largely influenced by race, gender, and sexual orientation. As UUs, we are called to widen our circle and embrace not just thoughts, but also actions in the aid of expanding the definition of what it means to be in relationship with one another, beyond simply focusing on our individual journeys. We call this practice covenanting. It comes from our Jewish and Christian roots. And unlike some of our Christian cousins, I think we are able to embrace the fullness of the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth without necessarily focusing on the Christhood in that faith. There's a scripture verse that I remember from my childhood that really informs my justice work even today. The Christian scripture of Matthew chapter 25, verses 35 through 40. It's a story of Jesus speaking with his disciples on just what the day of judgment might be like. In the explanation, he says that the king, or God, will welcome those who cared for the hungry, thirsty, strangers, those without clothes, sick, and incarcerated. In the story, Jesus uses the pronouns of I and me when quoting God, and this really confuses the disciples. They were like, "We never gave you food or drink. We don't remember when you were in need of clothes. You clearly aren't a stranger to us, and we've never visited you in prison either." To prove his point further, Jesus responds to their confusion by saying, "Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of my siblings, you did it to me." We are a covenantal faith. Our agreement is to care for one another even when our individual lives are inconvenienced. This past year of sacrifice has proven to me that we are capable of that level of love. We have a religious heritage that calls us to care for those in our midst, especially those who are disproportionately affected by these social determinants of health. And I just want to remind us that as our association president, Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, has said time and time again, that this is no time for a casual faith. We must see the atrocities in our midst and rage against them. We must hold our ground to protect those to which we are covenanted. Our faith demands that we not sit idly by while canary after canary is thrown into the pit. If we allow our individualism to block the work toward a better future for the whole, then we are certain to fail as a society and possibly a faith tradition. My question for each of us is simple. Will we continue sending canaries to their death, or can we instead work to celebrate the bright color and their song?
I've always been very glad to know that the stages of grief really aren't in a set, lockstep order. And I'm glad because I've noticed this pattern in myself after loss, which is that I pretty quickly just skip all the other steps and go right to bargaining. Bargaining is what I find myself always doing the morning after a major loss. When someone I love has died and I wake up that first morning in a new world that I don't quite comprehend yet without them, I think to myself on those mornings, no, I don't think I want this world. You can have it back. I don't want this to be true. We can't unknow the sight of those fire-blackened hills which come just before the greening now in this seasons of climate-changing world. We can't unsee the urban cardboard and tent villages that spill across our highways and byways in this Bay Area. We can't unhear George Floyd's rasping voice saying, "They'll kill me," or Eric Gardner saying, "I can't breathe." We can't uncount all the empty storefronts, some of whom wrote thank you notes to customers that only a few of their customers saw because it was so many months ago now, and the streets have still been empty. We can't ungrieve the number of new plaques in our own memorial garden since most of us were last on campus. We cannot unsee the still unfinished strings of beads that will wrap the trees in the Chapel Memorial Grove redwoods to memorialize individual lives lost to COVID-19. And this week, we are likely to cross the 500,000 mark for our nation. We cannot unknow the despair of our youth and our young people who have lost milestone years and who wonder what the future is that they are really inheriting. We cannot unview those images that we just saw a few of from our nation's capital under siege in this, our United States. And we cannot unknow that so many of our nation's senators chose party politics over the now ever-known possibility of autocracy and authoritarianism returning. We still wake up, as I do each morning after a loss of a beloved, and wonder to ourselves sometimes, what is this world? The way we did in November and December of 2016, and on January 7th of this year, and during the fire seasons from the last couple years, with that voice in our head saying, I don't want this world. I don't want to know it. And yet we cannot unknow it. We just can't. This is a lot to hold. And yet, because we cannot unknow it, we must speak of these things with one another. We must be that sanctuary to one another. We must hold them together. We must grieve them together. We must try to figure out what this new reemergent world will be together. We also, though, have other things to hold together, for we also cannot unknow how much better we understand our interdependence now than we did just a year ago. Our interdependence not only with each other, but with the rest of the natural world. We cannot forget and unknow the blue of the sky after just a few weeks and the quiet of the night last spring after we stopped all our mad dashing about in individual vehicles. We cannot unknow how ordinary people did their everyday jobs as health providers and grocery store workers and drivers and other things. And they made it possible for the rest of us to be here today as sentient beings. We can't unknow how heroic our youth and young adults would be, how they would hear the call of black and brown voices and lead many of us into the streets to affirm that Black Lives Matter at the beginning of last summer. We can't unknow how we made masks before a mask industry was born and how we gifted them to one another, our neighbors, and to those without resources to buy them even now. We cannot unknow how easily the hard-won rights of women, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and queer people can be turned back, and yet we also will not unknow how loudly we spoke out for them to be reinstated quickly. We cannot unknow how those of us with resources came together to learn and laugh and be on each other's lifelines on screens. And we cannot unknow how when someone needed something, food, a postcard for advocacy, a listening ear, a virtual hug, we did our best to provide it. We cannot unknow this either, or turn back the clock to live in that other world, and maybe we don't want to. We cannot unknow the joy that some among us are feeling right now because they have had not just the 2 vaccines, but they are actually true, what I call 2 twos, because they're 2-2'd, meaning they have the critical 2 vaccines and those critical 2 weeks past vaccine 2. We can celebrate that teachers and essential workers are now priority for vaccination as of this week, and at this time, we cannot unknow that our renewed appreciation of the ways that we can blend science and faith, the science that gave us those vaccines, and images from Mars as well this week, is appreciated and expanded. We cannot unknow that people working tirelessly in coalitions to counter the effects that they knew that gerrymandering, voter intimidation, and suppression were likely to have ensured that people did vote. And there is an amazing article about the depth of those coalitions and the extent of their work in Time magazine this week. And it details how Those partnerships included an unusual, unprecedented partnership between the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the AFL-CIO, as well as countless progressive groups. We cannot uncelebrate the tenacity of leaders like Stacey Abrams and the principled leaders of all political stripes in Georgia and other states. We cannot unknow that when, despite misinformation, disinformation, false news, when turnout happened in record numbers and the majority still chose the yet unfulfilled promise of democracy. And we cannot unknow that the world we are recreating this spring in these coming months, as more and more of us can reemerge to some extent with a higher degree of safety, will not be the one we left last year. And for all of this, for all the enormity of what we cannot unknow and yet somehow must, we know we can do it together. We have a lot to learn. And we have opportunities to do that together. We'll start that relearning, by the way, on Thursday when I'm restarting my minister's class on this subject. And all of this, we also know now very deeply at our core the power we have of adaptation. We know that we have had to adapt, and we have. And we have to, because to try to unknow what we already know would be like that morning after my loss, when I try to turn back the world to the morning before, but it can't happen. However, in some ways it would be more dangerous and perhaps even morally repugnant to try to unknow, because it would also be to disrespect those whose lives have been lost or damaged if we stay on the path that got us here. To know what we know and to not do anything differently when the chasms and divides are now so apparent before us would be, well, to deny the facts, which we will speak more about next week. The thing is that we can unknow what we know now, and yet there are many things we've learned that we need to build upon. The ways people worked across lines to minimize threats to our democracy, the ways that working at home did reduce air pollution and bodily stress on many people, how much richer our intellectual climate is now that we're hearing more of the voices of the people we haven't been listening to. There's so many things we could celebrate, including the leadership of our youngest among us. And if we do this in community, we can also drill down into some new emerging data, such as a study coming out of Massachusetts that says that the police killing of Black people has been reduced, they estimate perhaps by 300 lives, in areas where Black Lives Matter protests were held on a large scale. They're seeing a very clear scientific correlation. And we can look at statistics that we need to wrestle with about the rate of failure of Black and Latina-owned businesses, which failed at rates of 40 and 33% compared to the 17% rate of white business failures, which might be tied to the fact that the vast majority of those precious PPP loans, of which we are personally so grateful here, went to white-owned businesses and larger corporations with assets. We need to stand in solidarity with our Asian neighbors, including elders who have been targeted for violent hate. And we need to look at the cost of this pandemic on parents, and especially on women who were in the workforce. We need to listen to experts such as the very renowned Southern Poverty Law Center, whose reports are saying that what is needed to end the spread of hate and conspiracy theory is not deep and empathetic listening. It is cult deprogramming efforts. We need to listen and to learn together. We cannot unknow a presidency which made a mockery of our government. We cannot unknow a pandemic. We cannot unknow the images of a rising tide of hatred or the images of what it means, the visceral bodily fear to live in a time of climate change. We cannot unknow what it felt like in our bodies when we were confined to our houses, separated from those we most love, even at the most holy days of our years. And if we rush back into everything as if we've never experienced any of this, we do it at our own peril. If we try to push away what it is we most certainly do know now, we will, I know, regret it. This won't be a time of returning to normal, for normal will never return for most. This is a time of transformation, and we need to hear those who understand the power of transformation. We need to think about our decisions and look at places like Detroit, which have already found themselves transformed. And we need to know that we can listen to the voice of great leaders like Grace Lee Boggs, who said, "Transform yourself to transform the world." In this time of reemergence, in this chrysalis time, as I've come to think of it, we know we can love one another deeply. And we know, whether we wish to know it or not, that we can wake up on that morning after, not with that sense of dread, but with our mind stayed on justice. We know that we can wake up with our mind stayed on compassion and a vision of an undivided family of being. If we choose to take what we now know as a gift from the gods, we can use it in a sacred way, take part of it and reemerge into a better, more covenantal sense of how we can be sanctuary. Sanctuary for ourselves, for one another, for the larger family of humanity, and for the family of creation as well. May these commitments, through our actions, become what we cannot unknow or undo.